Hello everyone, we're here at the Peggy Notebart Nature Museum, and today we're going to give a quick tour of a pollinator garden. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about your role here at the museum.
Hi, my name is Seth Harper. I'm the manager of horticulture here at the Peggy Notebart Museum. I've been here for the last 14 years, and for a lot of that time I've been working on this, the Woody Wickham butterfly garden, which at this point is expanded into be more than just for butterflies, but really a space for all pollinators and for people to come see them.
So tell me a little bit about pollinators. Why are they important, and why is having a pollinator garden such a helpful thing for them?
Yeah, pollinators of course are necessary for many plants in their reproductive cycle. Without pollinators to transfer pollen from the male parts of the flower to the female, the seeds will never form, the plants will never reproduce. And so many of our native species in particular depend on the particular pollinators that they've evolved with. And so it's important to make space for all of these critters and the plants that support them.
And have you had any specific strategies for picking which plants to put in this garden?
Yeah, I have, and I've learned a lot over the years. I think I should start off by saying there's a difference between a pollinator garden and a native plant garden. We've chosen to make this garden include native and non-native plants. And part of that is in recognition of being in the middle of a large urban area where many people are doing conventional gardening. And we don't have anything against that, and we recognize that many non-native species can also be beneficial to pollinators, especially as nectar sources. So a pollinator garden in particular uses whatever plants one chooses to support pollinators by providing nectar sources mostly, while as a native plant garden is exclusively using native plants. You could have a native plant garden that doesn't support pollinators very well, and you could have a pollinator garden that doesn't contain native plants. But what's ideal, I feel, is to do a little of both. So we've got all of that going on here, and I'm personally a gardener. I enjoy gardening as a hobby, and I think it's really fun to be able to use a variety of plants, as long as we steer clear of invasive species, to create a garden like this. This is common milkweed. This is a backbone of many pollinator gardens, particularly butterfly gardens. And even up until just a few years ago, it was pretty much just considered an annoying weed in most people's gardens. And in fact, it does spread aggressively, and you need to keep it under wraps. But it's a food source for monarch caterpillar butterflies and monarch butterfly caterpillars. So any plant that feeds the juvenile stage of an insect, particularly a butterfly, is known as a host plant. And so it's important to have host plants in a pollinator garden to support that species throughout its life cycle. So the famous example, of course, is the monarch butterfly on milkweed, but there are many other host plants for other butterflies that are often very specific also. So we want to have both the adult nectar sources and host plants. Interestingly, common milkweed is one of the more a very useful plant because it's both. It's a good nectar source for adult butterflies, and it's a host plant for juvenile monarchs. And there are multiple species of milkweed that you can grow in our gardens in this area. There's about a dozen or so native species. 3 or 4 really good ones for our gardens are, of course, common milkweed. Then we have butterfly weed, which is in bloom now. That's the bright orange one. It's a very good garden plant. Unfortunately, it's not as effective as a host plant. The caterpillars don't feed on it as much. There's also whorled milkweed, which has white flowers, and the one you're most likely to see in a garden center is swamp milkweed, which has beautiful pink flowers, and it's pretty easy to grow. A couple other native plant groups that are very important in pollinator gardens are the goldenrods and the asters. Now, those are both going to start blooming later in the year for us, but I can show you some of the more important ones that I like to grow. This is aromatic aster, which is a good choice because it tends to suffer less damage from rabbits than some of the other aster species. This is New England aster, which is our showiest aster. Has big, bright, purplish blue flowers, and it's very easy to grow and will often show up on its own in pollinator gardens. And then this is a goldenrod called rough goldenrod, Solidago rugosa. And it's a nice one for the garden because it's a little less aggressive than some of the other goldenrods. That's always a problem with goldenrods, is how aggressively they spread and outcompete other plants. So if you can find more tame ones, they're excellent nectar sources in late summer and into fall. All phlox are of native parentage. Phlox is a native genus of plants. Garden phlox, of course, are one of the backbones of the perennial garden. So there are many varieties that are attractive to butterflies. Look for ones that have bright color. So one of the things I like to do in terms of creating a pollinator garden is to work with the plants that just show up on their own. There's a couple of weeds in particular that I like to leave in place because they're host plants for our common caterpillars. For example, this is Pennsylvania pellitory, which is a host plant for red admiral butterflies, and it's a pretty innocuous little weed that it doesn't really take over, so you can let it go and provide some host plant, and you don't even have to buy it. It'll show up on its own. And then over here we have, well, I've stepped on it, but just some common blue violet. I often leave violets in place. Here's some more over here that are a little better looking. These are host plants for many different butterflies in the fritillary group. This plant is called calamint. It's not in bloom yet, but a little bit later on in the year it'll start having these masses of little white flowers. Excellent pollinator plant for bees in particular. Lots of nectar available well through the gardening season, all into late summer, and even small butterflies will take nectar from these. It's important to keep in mind when you're shopping for pollinator plants that the people who are trying to sell you plants are trying to sell you plants, and they may exaggerate some of the pollinator assisting capabilities of these plants, especially things that have been bred for human enjoyment. So things like a zinnia that has had many of its internal parts replaced with petals is not going to be very productive, but the catalog will still tell you this zinnias are attractive to pollinators, even though this particular one probably isn't. So it's important to be careful about what you're selecting. So here's a wild type of rose, and you can see in the middle there are many of the reproductive parts with pollen, and there's actually nectar in there, and we just saw a bee buzz out of here. So this is actually a great pollinator plant, but now let's compare that to a cultivated rose. This is a cultivated rose, and we could see that many of those floral parts are much more reduced. There's fewer of them. They're actually been replaced by petals as the plant has been mutated through breeding. And we might find these plants very beautiful, but unfortunately they don't do as much for pollinators as more of the wild types. Generally speaking, in a pollinator garden, wild types are more nectar rich and able to be used by pollinators, and things that have been bred more for human enjoyment often lose nectar or characteristics that attract pollinators. So it's better to stick typically with wild forms, because a lot of times, as with the rose or with many plants like chrysanthemums, the parts that are actually providing nectar and pollen have been bred away and replaced by things with petals that don't actually help the pollinators. And then, even ones that, maybe still have some of the floral parts that have the nectaries and so forth in them, they might lose their attractive characteristics. They might lose, like, the ultraviolet signatures that the bees look for, and stuff like that. Trees and shrubs can also be part of butterfly or pollinator gardens. This tree is called a Korean EVODIA. It's also known as a BB tree. And if a few weeks from now, these buds will open into nectar-rich, pollen-rich flowers that will attract a lot of bees. I think that's part of the reason why it's called a BB tree, although also the seeds are round and black like a BB. Now, I recommend planting only the males of this species because we don't want it to get established as some sort of invader, but I haven't heard any reports of it doing that, but let's not take the risk. But the male, of course, will not produce fruit, and so you can just enjoy the flowers and the pollinator potential that they have. Another good one, of course, is lilacs. Lilacs are a good nectar source in early part of the year, especially for things like red admirals or some of the butterflies that emerge pretty early. salvias are very popular. These are typical European plants, but they're very common in many gardens these days, and for good reason. They bloom for a long time and they have that beautiful electric blue color. And many of them are good pollinator plants. They provide a lot of nectar for bees and for small butterflies. Okay, this is pale purple coneflower. Everybody knows about purple coneflower. It's a very closely related species. Pale purple coneflower is a little bit less spectacular, but honestly I think it's a better nectar source. And later in the year, the seeds are one of the favorites of goldfinches. This is bronze fennel. It's a really pretty plant, and it's also tasty if you like fennel. It has sort of like an anise-like flavor. This is an excellent host plant for black swallowtail caterpillars. Of course, black swallowtails are a big showy butterfly, so it's fun to get them to come around along with the monarchs. So this plant is in the same family as dill and parsley and many of the other plants that are you might put in your herb garden that you might find black swallowtails eating to the ground. But this is a good choice, and it's very ornamental. This is called common rue. It's actually a non-native plant, but interestingly, it's a host plant for black swallowtail caterpillars. It's not actually in the same family that most of the host plants for those caterpillars are. Generally, they eat things like parsley, dill, our native golden Alexanders, and things in the carrot family. But this plant is in a very different plant family, but it has a very similar sort of chemical signature to its leaves. So basically it tastes a lot like the plants that the black swallowtail caterpillars are used to eating. So the females will lay their eggs on this plant, and the caterpillars will feed on it and be raised to adulthood. We should be careful with this plant. Some people are sensitive to the sap and it can cause a rash. Lovage is another one of those black swallowtail host plants. It's a celery-like herb, but as you can see, it gets some pretty good size to it, and it's a perennial, so you don't have to replant it every year like a lot of our herbs. Even some of our native grasses can be host plants. This is little bluestem. It's a very important grass for the tall grass prairies, and it actually is a host plant for skipper and nymph butterflies.
From your perspective as an expert, is it hard to have a pollinator garden?
No, not at all. Some of these plants are very easy to grow, and a lot of them are pretty easy to find in garden centers too.
And if you could pick 3 plants for a beginner pollinator garden for someone to use at home, do you have 3 that come to mind?
Well, I don't know if I could pick just 3, but I think things like butterfly weed or common milkweed, of course, are excellent. It's really important to have some nectar late into the summer, so something like Joe Pye weed or some of the goldenrods that are a little less aggressive are good, and things like New England aster, other asters that will carry you into the fall are all really good choices. It's also important how you care for the garden in the off season. It's a good idea not to clear everything away. A lot of the insect species will be overwintering, and they may be in leaf litter or as eggs on stems. So it's good to leave those, if you can, until plants really start emerging in the early summer.
And have you seen any creative pollinator gardens before, like maybe having a little one on a balcony if you live in the city and don't have a yard? Have you seen anything like that?
I get asked that question a lot, and I think one of the easiest things to do is to have a little herb garden with a lot of those herbs that we talked about that support black swallowtail caterpillars. They may show up on a balcony as long as you're not too high up in the air.